Hello everyone and welcome to my presentation, Equitable Access to L2 Learning and Literacy, a Pedagogical Framework of Digital Game-Based Learning. The literature on digital gaming and language learning demonstrates that digital games have a great potential for L2 learning and literacy. Also, it shows that digital gaming offers a promising platform for equitable and inclusive L2 learning and literacy, especially for young adults who struggle with learning. So some of the reported learning benefits of video gaming include developing learners' autonomy, intercultural and multilingual interaction, L2 literacy, collaborative social interaction, literacy development, extramural L2 learning, L2 socialization, L2 languaging, and L2 vocabulary learning. However, the applications of digital game-based L2 learning and literacy are still rather limited. So the use of video games in classrooms is very limited. A potential reason for that is the lack of pedagogical guidance in the practice of integrating video games in the language classroom. So what I'm proposing in this presentation is a pedagogical framework of digital game-based L2 learning and literacy that can guide language educators in effectively using commercial video games in language learning and literacy. And the point here is to balance engagement with learning, so when video games are integrated in the classroom, we can maintain the engaging experience of gameplay that keeps learners engaged, while at the same time make sure there is a learning benefit from engaging in gameplay. The framework is divided into three sections: selection, adaptation, and integration. So the first part is dealing with selecting an appropriate video game that lends itself to language learning and literacy. The second is adaptation, which is adapting gameplay to the purpose and goal of language learning and literacy. And integration is about integrating game-based language use and learning into the broader curriculum of the language course. So let's go over these in more depth. So selection is about selecting video gaming titles that lend themselves to L2 learning and literacy. And the reason why we need to be very selective in which games or which gaming titles we use is that most video games are not designed to be educational. So not all the features of game design or game-based interaction or gameplay configuration are appropriate for language learning. Some are very conducive of language learning, some are not. And the research suggests that digital game-based language learning is a highly ecological activity that is shaped by the gaming ecology. So you have to be very careful when selecting a video game, because the design and forms of interaction afforded by that game will highly impact its learning potential. So some of the general selection criteria include selecting an engaging and immersive video game, a video game that offers learners an engaging experience, because this engagement is what will keep students participating in the activity and immersed in language use. Another quality is the integration of L2 discourse in gameplay, and by that I mean that learners need to rely on language use and engaging with L2 discourses to understand the rules of the game and participate effectively in gameplay. So if the game, for example, uses in-game discourses, these discourses have to be crucial for figuring out gameplay and progressing in the game. And if it relies on collaborative interaction, then collaborative interaction should be key to gameplay, and language use and social interaction should be integral to managing gameplay. Another quality is the realism of the game narrative and scenario. And the reason for that is that the language used around gameplay is typically very relevant to the context of gameplay and the narrative and scenario of the game. So if you're using a realistic video game that simulates real life situations, students are more likely to use language that can transfer to their daily life interaction and that they can use in day-to-day communications. Whereas if you use a very mythical video game that has imaginary characters, the language that they can learn from this video game is probably not going to be very useful in their communicative language practice. The next quality of a good video game is semiotic complexity of the virtual world, and by that I mean the abundance of semiotic resources and signs in the virtual world of the game, including images, sounds, and signs. And the reason why this is key is that most language learners would rely on these semiotic signs to weave together the meaning of unfamiliar in-game discourses and design their meaning in the course of gameplay. So the abundance of semiotic resources would provide resources for learners to make meaning of unfamiliar discourses without interrupting the flow of gameplay. Another important quality is the intensity of in-game action. We want to be careful to select a game that's not that doesn't have intense action or timed decision making, because if the student is put under time pressure or under a lot of stress from successive action, he or she wouldn't have the time to pay attention to in-game discourses or pay attention to the language used by co-players. So giving students a little bit of time to reflect on the language and attend to in-game discourses is important for internalizing these discourses and developing their language. So we want to pick games that are not heavy in action or not time-bound, so they would have more time for analysis and reflection. Also, the complexity of gameplay and access to game culture are really important. If the game is really complex and it's mediated in a foreign language, that can make it very difficult for a learner to participate in the game. So we want to pick a game that's moderately complex, because the complexity of gameplay added to the challenge of using a foreign language to manage the game can make it overwhelming for the students and cognitively overloading. Also, access to the game culture is very important. So if the game culture is very open, and by game culture I mean the gaming community or the community of players around the game. Some game cultures are more open and welcoming, and students can easily participate in them, and some gaming communities are more closed and they're not very welcoming of new players who are not very proficient in the game. So we want to be very selective in which gaming community and which game culture are we bringing our students into. Finally, we want to focus on or pay attention to the level and form of game-based language use. So what kind of language is used in a game, how complex this language is, and make sure it's appropriate for the level of students we're dealing with. So we want to make the language used in the game essentially I+1 relative to the level of our students. So these are generally some of the selection criteria for selecting video games that are appropriate for language learning. A good example is The Simpsons Tapped Out, which is available on for iPhones and tablets. It's a good example because it's very simple, very rich in graphics and sign, rich in language use, highly contextualized in the narrative, very realistic, and the language is very appropriate for the level of ESL learners. Now, the second part of the model or the framework is adaptation, and by that I mean adjusting gameplay activities to emphasize L2 practice and literacy, because gameplay is not necessarily focused on language learning. So what we do is we twist gameplay activities a little bit to make sure that they emphasize L2 practice and support language learning and literacy. So we add a language learning and literacy dimension to gameplay while maintaining engagement, because if we turn it into a completely educational activity, it will lose its engagement and students will just give up on it. So we try to scaffold game-based L2 use to promote attention to discourses, socialization in language discourses and literacy skills without jeopardizing the engagement of the gaming experience. There are several forms of adapting video game or gameplay for L2 learning and literacy purposes. So one form is promoting L2 practice and literacy around gameplay. For example, asking students to record a strategy guide, write a game narrative, fill in a gaming journal that emphasizes certain aspects of the gaming experience, certain literacy skills, or vocabulary they have noticed during gameplay. We can also promote collaborative gameplay around the game, either online or face-to-face. Another form of adapting gameplay for L2 learning and literacy is promoting decoding and noticing of new discourses by having students complete questionnaires about the game rules, for example, which would require them to pay close attention to the discourses used in the game, to deduce the game rules, asking students to fill in a journal about in-game discourses that they have noticed or that they have designed, and asking them to guess their meaning, moderating a discussion about the game rules between students to get them again thinking about the discourses they encountered in the game and what they mean, and trying to put the pieces together and make meaning of these discourses and use them in their interaction. Another form of adapting video games is promoting L2 interaction and socialization by encouraging collaborative play, for example, either face-to-face between students or online with native speakers, assigning research tasks in the gaming community, so asking students to become part of the gaming community and complete a certain task, like identify secret trophies in a game or figure out a solution to a specific challenge in the game. Also, we can have moderate discussion of gameplay strategies and ask students to reflect on their gameplay experiences. So all of these are different ways of promoting language use and learning around gameplay while maintaining focus on the engagement of gameplay. So for example, if we're adapting gameplay to promote listening and speaking, we can ask students to play a role-playing video game in pairs where one student is a player and the second student is a planner. And the player has to control the game in the in-game character or avatar, and the planner uses the internet to find strategy guides and advise the player. So students would be constantly in conversation, in dialogue about what the player comes across in the game and what the planner finds online, and they will be asking questions. So that will promote a lot of listening and speaking, along also with some reading, but it promotes a lot of listening and speaking because we have the two students cooperating to manage gameplay, and they are so immersed and engaged in the activity, so language use becomes more purposeful and the students are more motivated. Another example is if we're adapting gameplay to promote reading and writing, we can ask students to play an adventure video game individually and consult online discussion boards in the gaming community for information about gameplay and game strategies. And after reaching a certain level in the game, students can then be asked to write narrative essays that trace their trajectories in the game, essentially their storyline in the game, or the storyline of their characters in the game. The last stage or level of the framework is integration, and by integration I mean integrating digital game-based language learning and literacy in the language curriculum, in the sense that we bridge the gap between the extracurricular use of the video gaming as a language learning context and the language curriculum that we use in class. So essentially, we use digital gaming as an extracurricular activity to support curricular goal, and we also extend language learning and practice outside of the classroom to gameplay, and we extend the use of language and discourses learned or acquired in gameplay to the context of the classroom. Again, there are different forms of integrating gameplay in the language curriculum. One form is recycling digital game-based language learning and literacy practices in the classroom. So for example, we can reinforce extracurricular language use by designing activities centered on gameplay that would require students to recycle or reuse or re-practice discourses that they have practiced and acquired in gameplay. For example, if we ask students to write about the game or discuss the game, they are likely to use discourses that they have noticed in the game and picked from the game to discuss the game theme and narrative and strategies. Another way is to tailor digital game-based language learning and literacy practice to target instructional goals, in the sense that we extend curricular practice beyond the classroom to the context of gameplay. So for example, we might be focusing on a certain grammatical lesson in class, so we ask students to play a specific game and use it in a specific way that requires them to use that specific grammatical lesson in gameplay. For example, we might be talking about the future perfect, and we ask students to play a certain game and try to anticipate what would happen to their in-game characters or avatars in the next level of the game. So they would be using the future perfect to talk about the video game or their in-game characters in the game. Another form of integrating video games in the language curriculum is utilizing gameplay as a prompt for language use. So here we're not focusing on the game as a context for language use, but as a subject and a shared activity and topic of common interest among students. So asking students to talk about their experience, asking students to reflect on what they have done on the game, asking students to compete with each others and discuss aspects of the game, asking students to present a strategy guide or to talk about the secrets and trophies in the game. So really using the game not as an activity, but the gaming experience as a topic that can prompt active and immersive language use in the class. Another form of integration is moving L2 learning and literacy to the inline gaming community, in the sense that we take the classroom to the online gaming community and use that community as a language learning resource. For example, we can use it as a source for authentic texts that students can use to practice reading. We can use it as a writing platform where students can write, for example, fan fiction or strategy guides and interact with a real audience and get feedback on their writing. We can use it as a platform for intercultural social interaction with native speakers. So essentially like a telecollaboration platform where students interact with native speaker around the shared activity of gameplay. So these were different ways of integrating video games in the language curriculum. And here's an example from an ESL class where we're teaching past simple tense and narrative writing, and we design a language, digital game-based language learning activity to target those two goals. So we ask students to play an adventure video game like Grand Theft Auto or God of War or Assassin's Creed Odyssey. And in class we have students share and discuss their gameplay progress. So they have to use the past simple to talk about what they did in the game. Also the instructor can guide the discussion to discuss elements of a narrative based on their experience playing a role-playing game, or an adventure game that develops more like a narrative. So they think of what happened to their characters and how the character developed, and the rising action and the falling action, and kind of deduce these elements of a narrative from their gaming experience. And we can also have the students write a narrative essay after they understand the concepts of a narrative and the elements that comprise a narrative, and they get some practice in using past simple tense, and ask them to write their gameplay trajectory. So write your story or your narrative in the game as a recollection. So you are writing a story about your experience in God of War as a historical narrative of old Greek mythology. So the students would have to understand or apply his or her understanding of the elements that comprise a narrative in writing. And he or she would also need to use the past simple tense to write this essay. So in this case, we'd be using the video game to complement what they are learning in class, and we would integrate digital game-based language learning in the course curriculum by targeting curricular goals in gameplay. So this is my framework, and we have talked about the selection, adaptation, and integration of video games. I hope you can find this useful and you can apply it in your class. And I'm looking forward to reading your comments and answering your questions. Thank you very much.